August 4th, 1943. A cold, wet fog rolled over Bovington Camp in Dorset, England. The air carried the smell of oil, steel, and anticipation. Inside a drafty command tent, Major General A.C. Richardson sat alone at a wooden desk. Before him lay a thick file stamped in bold red ink. Most secret. Exercise Dracula. He adjusted his glasses, dipped his pen, and began to write his first line. The reliability trial begins today. 3 nations' tanks will travel 2,000 miles across Britain. Only one will prove fit for modern war. He paused, staring at the words as if they carried more weight than ink. In a way, they did. This wasn't just a trial of machines. It was a test of national pride. Beyond the tent, 11 tanks stood in formation on the parade ground, their shapes blurred by mist. The engines idled, growling and coughing like beasts waiting to be unleashed. 3 American Sherman M4A2s, powered by General Motors' twin diesel engines, purred with smooth mechanical confidence. 3 Sherman M4A4s, each driven by Chrysler's complicated multi-bank petrol engine, rumbled steadily, every cylinder in harmony. Then came the British entries. 3 Cromwell M. cruiser tanks, boasting the brand-new Rolls Royce Meteor engine. They growled with a raw, powerful tone that impressed the ear. But to the trained listener, something in the rhythm was off. Beside them stood 2 improved Cromwell Mach 3s and 3 Centaur Mach Es, still using the old Liberty engine that had doomed so many earlier British tanks. No one among the crews knew it yet, but this formation, 11 tanks lined up in the fog, was about to rewrite how nations thought about warfare itself. The trial, officially named Exercise Dracula, was not about gunnery or tactics. It was about one question. When a tank is sent to fight, will it still be running when it gets there? That question had haunted Britain since the deserts of North Africa. For years, British tank crews had faced not the German Panzer as their worst enemy, but their own machines. In 1942, the British Crusader tank, fast on paper at 26 cm per, broke down so often that soldiers joked it needed a spare tank just to tow its broken one home. Oil leaks stained the sand, radiators boiled over in the African heat, and transmissions shattered under the strain of desert warfare. The conditions inside the tanks were nightmarish. Temperatures soared past 130 degrees. Crews worked in choking dust, sweat burning their eyes, while electrical systems failed and suspensions cracked. Tankers learned to carry spare parts as if they were ammunition. They expected breakdowns like they expected enemy fire. Then came the American M4 Sherman, the tank Britain hadn't asked for, but soon couldn't live without. Under the Lend-Lease program, thousands of Shermans rolled off U.S. assembly lines and arrived in North Africa. British crews immediately noticed something almost magical. The Shermans started every morning. They kept running all day. They didn't need constant nursing, endless spare parts, or mechanical prayer. Yes, they were a little slower. 25 minutes to the Crusaders' theoretical 26. But when the fighting started, the Sherman was there, ready. And in war, ready beats fast every single time. Even General Bernard Montgomery, never one to praise American equipment lightly, admitted privately that American tanks could be depended upon to work, while British tanks remained temperamental at best and dangerously unreliable at worst. That simple truth cut deep into British pride. For decades, Britain had prided itself on world-class engineering, from Spitfires to steam engines. Yet when it came to tanks, the record was embarrassing. The Covenanter, introduced in 1941, had been hailed as the future of armored warfare. 1,700 were built, and not one saw combat. Its cooling system failed so consistently that it could barely survive a summer day in southern England. The Crusader improved little. The Cavalier, another next big thing, inherited the same unreliable Liberty engine and was quickly downgraded to training duties. The pattern was undeniable. British tanks looked good on blueprints and parades, but broke down in battle. The salvation, it seemed, would come from a name that had already saved Britain once. Rolls Royce. W.A. Robotham, a brilliant engineer at the company, proposed a daring idea. Take the Merlin aircraft engine, the same one that powered the legendary Spitfire, and turn it into a tank engine. The result was the Rolls Royce Meteor, a 600-horsepower V12 beast designed for land instead of sky. It promised speed, power, and, most importantly, reliability. By January 1943, production began across multiple British factories: Leyland Motors, English Electric, Metro Camel, and others. The A-27M Cromwell tank was born, touted as Britain's comeback, the tank that would restore the Empire's engineering reputation. By summer, hundreds of Cromwells rolled off the line. They looked magnificent. They were fast, over 40 mm on the test track, the fastest British tank ever built. Armed with a 75 mm gun and boasting aircraft-grade horsepower, it seemed Britain finally had its answer to the Sherman. But beneath the excitement, small warning signs began to emerge. Training reports mentioned oil leaks, brake failures, clutch jams, and steering trouble. One instructor wrote that the Cromwell could outrun its own control system. These were minor issues under controlled conditions. But what about real war? What would happen after 100 miles of mud, cold, and exhaustion? The War Office needed proof, not promises. And so they planned an endurance trial so demanding, so exhaustive, that no engineer could hide behind excuses. In July 1943, Britain's top tank officers authorized Exercise Dracula, a 2,000-mile reliability run across the entire country. Tanks would travel through villages, over moors, across rough farmland and paved roads, and in every kind of weather Britain could conjure. Maintenance would be limited to what a field crew could perform in combat. No factory tools, no civilian mechanics, no special treatment. Every repair, every delay, every breakdown would be logged. Each tank would face the same terrain, the same hours, and the same pressure. It was, quite literally, the fairest fight machines could have. The competitors were 3 Sherman M4A2s, running General Motors twin diesels, the workhorses of Allied armor. 3 Sherman M4A4s, with Chrysler's ingenious 5-engine multi-bank system, complex yet field-proven. 3 Cromwell MKIs, powered by the new Meteor. 2 Cromwell MK3s, improved but still experimental. And 3 Centaur MKIs, powered by the aging Liberty engine, included as a baseline for comparison. As the engines roared to life that morning, Major General Richardson looked out through the fog. What he saw wasn't just steel, it was ideology. The American machines represented mass production, standardization, and practical reliability. The British tanks embodied craftsmanship, speed, and theoretical superiority. The question was, which philosophy actually won wars? Over the next 7 weeks, the answer unfolded mile by mile. The Shermans ran with mechanical grace, their engines steady, their crews confident. They needed fuel, grease, and rest, but rarely repairs. The Cromwells? They were fast, but the faster they went, the more they shook themselves apart. Oil leaks worsened, brake pads burned out, Steering clutches jammed. Mechanics grew weary of fixing what had been promised to never fail. The Centaur, burdened with the ancient Liberty engine, was even worse. Sputtering, overheating, coughing smoke like a dying dragon. By the time the 2,000-mile mark was reached, the data told a brutal truth. The Shermans had completed the journey with minimal trouble. The Cromwells had needed 3 times more maintenance hours, and the Centaurs had spent nearly as much time under repair as they had moving. Richardson's final report was merciless. The outstanding lesson of this trial is the exceptional reliability of the American tanks. Crews operating British machines were in constant fear of mechanical failure. Under war conditions, that fear would mean defeat. It wasn't just about tanks anymore. It was about philosophy. The Americans had built for reliability, even if that meant lower performance on paper. The British had built for perfection and ended up with fragile brilliance. One side designed for mass production, the other designed for mechanical pride, and only one of them made it to the battlefield in one piece. The shock of Exercise Dracula rippled through British command. It forced a hard realization. Winning wars wasn't about the most powerful weapon. It was about the weapon that worked when you needed it. In the months that followed, British doctrine quietly shifted. The Cromwell would see action, but only after its flaws were hammered out and American tanks had carried much of the Allied advance across Europe. The lesson learned in the damp fog of Dorset would echo through decades of military procurement. Reliability beats brilliance. Consistency beats elegance. The tank that starts every morning wins the war. As the last engines went silent at Bovington that morning, the mist began to lift. Major General Richardson closed his notebook and looked across the field. The ground was slick with oil, mud, and pride. He didn't need to read the numbers to know the truth. The war had just crowned its quiet victor. Not the fastest, not the prettiest, but the one that simply refused to quit. The humble Sherman had proven what every soldier already knew. In battle, the best machine isn't the strongest one. It's the one that's still running when the smoke clears. The first 10 days of Exercise Dracula were spent in quiet but intense preparation at Bovington Camp, Britain's main armored training center. It wasn't glamorous work, no engines roaring across the countryside yet, but it was essential. Mechanics crawled over every inch of the participating tanks, checking oil lines, transmissions, cooling systems, and track tension. Every nut, bolt, and bearing was inspected, tested, and retorqued. The purpose was simple. When the trial began, no one could claim that a failure resulted from neglect. Each tank would start this test in proper mechanical condition. Any pre-existing defect, no matter how minor, was noted and corrected. Crews trained exhaustively with their assigned machines, learning their quirks and temperaments. Some found themselves growing attached to the tanks they'd soon be cursing. Others already distrusted them. Officers established a system of maintenance logs and observation records so detailed that future historians would marvel at their precision. Every mile, every defect, every repair would be documented. It wasn't enough to know which tank broke. They wanted to know why. As the days passed, an undeniable sense of rivalry began to build among the crews. The British tankers, proud of their engineering heritage, wanted badly to prove that the new Cromwell, their first Meteor-powered design, could finally beat the dependable American Sherman. The Sherman crews, by contrast, seemed calm. Many had already fought in North Africa. They knew what their tanks could do. They knew they started every morning without drama. They didn't boast. They didn't have to. At dawn, the 11 tanks rumbled out of Bovington's gates. It was a gray, windless morning. Dew clung to the hedgerows. The sound of engines, diesel and petrol, echoed off the mist-shrouded hills. The route ahead had been planned with military precision. Over the next 4 weeks, the formation would drive nearly 2,000 miles through the heart of England, up into Scotland, across into Wales, and finally back to Dorset. Each day would be grueling, a mix of road marches on paved highways, cross-country slogs through farm fields and moorland, and simulated tactical maneuvers designed to push the machines as close to combat stress as possible. There would be no special treatment. Tanks would face the full spectrum of British weather: rain, fog, biting wind, and the occasional sunlit reprieve. Every evening, at prearranged halts, maintenance would be carried out under the watchful eyes of Army observers, who recorded each repair with meticulous detail. It didn't take long for the differences between nations' machines to show. Within 10 miles of departure, one Centaur began trailing a thin stream of smoke from its engine deck. The ancient Liberty engine was already straining, its age and design flaws exposed by the simplest demand: sustained movement. By the time the formation reached its first overnight stop north of London, that same tank had developed a severe oil leak that took 2 hours to patch. A Cromwell, meanwhile, encountered brake fade while descending a long hill, its driver forced to shift into low gear to prevent disaster. The new Meteor engine delivered tremendous power, but the braking system clearly wasn't designed to handle it. The Shermans, on the other hand, reached the first stop without incident. Their crews carried out only routine checks, tightening track bolts, cleaning filters, and refueling. Then they rested. The difference was already striking. By the end of the first week, the observers' notebooks were thick with evidence. Patterns were forming, and they weren't flattering to the British machines. The Centaur tanks consistently arrived last at each day's destination, sometimes hours behind schedule. Their exhausted crews, covered in oil and grease, spent their evenings performing emergency maintenance by flashlight. Oil leaks plagued the Liberty engines, staining the roads behind them and causing chronic oil pressure loss. The cooling systems barely coped, forcing frequent stops to prevent overheating. Clutches slipped under load, and gear changes became unpredictable. Sometimes impossible. One Centaur required 8 continuous hours of work in a single night to stay operational. The once competitive spirit among its crew had evaporated, replaced by grim determination just to finish the route without being withdrawn. The Cromwells performed better, but not nearly as well as their designers had promised. Oil leaks were again a constant companion. Mechanics noted that engine seals failed with distressing regularity. The brakes, meant for a tank capable of 40 miles per hour, were dangerously underpowered. After several long descents, brake pads were found scorched or crumbling. Clutch failures became increasingly common as the Meteor engine's high torque exposed weaknesses in the drivetrain. Steering issues continued, even on improved models. Drivers reported difficulty maintaining direction over rough terrain, a deadly liability in real combat. Most damning of all, observers recognized these weren't new problems. They were known defects, previously reported in testing and development, problems that should have been fixed before the tanks ever left the factory. The Shermans, by contrast, ran with a quiet, almost boring reliability that impressed even their critics. They started every morning. They kept pace throughout the day. They required no heroics, no emergency repairs, no midnight rebuilds. When maintenance was needed, it was predictable. Routine checks, small adjustments, quick fixes. Nothing catastrophic. The M4A2 diesel Shermans performed especially well. One British mechanic, after examining their engines, remarked that they seemed nearly unbreakable. The more complex M4A4 multibank Shermans required a bit more attention, but even they outperformed the Cromwells and Centaurs by every measure. The difference wasn't about power or speed, it was about engineering philosophy. The Americans had designed for simplicity and durability. The British had designed for theoretical excellence, and built themselves into a trap of complexity. Captain Priestley of the Coldstream Guards, second in command of the Exercise, noticed another dimension to this mechanical struggle: the human cost. On paper, the Cromwells were the fastest tanks in the trial. In reality, they were often the last to arrive. Breakdowns meant delays, and delays rippled through the entire operation. Crews missed meals. Fuel trucks waited in the cold. Guides stood by for hours in the dark. Mechanics lost sleep fixing. Recurring issues. The stress accumulated invisibly, but relentlessly. A single mechanical failure didn't just affect one tank. It disrupted the rhythm of the entire formation. Morale suffered. Efficiency declined. The strain of unreliability extended far beyond metal and oil. It reached deep into the men themselves. By early September, as the formation neared the end of its 2,000-mile circuit, the data told a story so clear and devastating that no amount of pride could obscure it. Observers had tracked everything: mileage, maintenance time, number of defects, severity of failures. The compiled tables formed a brutal comparison. The three Sherman M4A2s covered 13,986 miles combined, exceeding even the planned distance. Across all three, they experienced 199 recorded defects, averaging 66 per tank. They required 420 hours of maintenance in total, just 0.03 hours per mile, or 2 minutes of maintenance for every mile traveled. In practical terms, they were nearly maintenance-free under trial conditions. Extraordinary performance for complex machines operating far from factory support. The M4A4 multibank Shermans showed slightly higher maintenance needs due to their intricate engine design, but the difference was marginal. Combined, all 6 Shermans demonstrated superior reliability that no British tank could match. The 5 Cromwell tanks covered 11,582 miles combined, yet suffered 367 defects, nearly double the Sherman's rate. They required 814 hours of maintenance, equating to 0.7 hours per mile, or more than 4 minutes of maintenance per mile. Twice the Sherman's burden. The 3 Centaur tanks were worse still. They covered only 8,192 miles combined, plagued by 297 defects and 742 maintenance hours. The Liberty engine simply couldn't handle the stress of modern warfare. They averaged 0.08 hours of maintenance per mile, almost 3 times the Sherman rate. In every measurable category, reliability, uptime, mechanical endurance, the Centaur failed. It was now undeniable. The Centaur was a mistake, kept alive only to maintain factory output, while Meteor production ramped up. The Exercise proved what many suspected: it should never have been built at all. When Major General Richardson submitted his final report, he didn't soften a single word. The simplicity and reliability of the American machines, in contrast with the British production, is to me the chief lesson of Dracula, he wrote. The Cromwell could no doubt be made into an equally good fighting vehicle, but redesigning must have as its chief object simplicity, which in turn will bring reliability. His assessment was backed by chilling numbers. A commander equipped with Shermans, the report stated, could be confident of taking 99% of his tanks into battle. A commander with Cromwells or Centaurs, by contrast, would live in constant anxiety, never sure how many machines would even reach the front line. Perhaps most. Humiliating of all was the report's final note. Exercise Dracula was conducted under conditions highly favorable to the machines, particularly the less reliable ones. Crews enjoyed full daylight for maintenance and adequate facilities each night. Such conditions would never exist in combat. Under true war conditions, reliability would decline sharply. Even under the best possible circumstances, the British tanks barely managed to keep moving. The Shermans, built in distant American factories by the thousands, simply worked. Exercise Dracula had begun as a test of machines. It ended as a revelation about engineering itself. In the battle between elegance and endurance, the winner was clear, and the lesson, though painful, would reshape British tank development for years to come. In the wake of Exercise Dracula, the results were sobering. The Cromwell tank, hailed as Britain's answer to Germany's panzers, had performed poorly even under controlled test conditions. If it could barely complete a proving ground exercise without breakdowns, what hope would it have under the brutal realities of combat? Under enemy fire, with little time for maintenance and far from spare parts. British engineers and observers knew the answer, even if it was painful to admit. One British observer, Richardson of the British Tank Mission, was especially candid in his private correspondence. He had been monitoring American testing of British tanks and, by October 1943, could no longer hide his embarrassment. "These tanks have made us a laughingstock out here," he wrote, referring to the Cromwell and Centaur models sent for American evaluation. "The Cromwell has had a variety of troubles that keep appearing. The Americans are politely indifferent to what happens to them, which is perhaps worse than open criticism." The tone of humiliation was palpable. Richardson went on to note that the Rolls Royce representative overseeing the Meteor engine trials was most unhappy and wanted the tanks withdrawn from testing altogether to avoid further embarrassment. His conclusion was blunt and uncompromising. Send no more British tanks to America until they are genuinely reliable and can compete with American equipment. For Richardson, and many like him, the lesson was clear. Britain had to rebuild its reputation for engineering quality from the ground up. That meant not rushing half-finished designs into production, no matter the wartime urgency. British engineers who analyzed the results of Exercise Dracula understood the technical causes behind the Cromwell's failings all too well. The Meteor engine, while far superior to the disastrous Liberty engine it replaced, was still a product of compromise. It was derived from an aircraft power plant, and aircraft engines are designed for relatively steady operating conditions, constant revolutions, predictable cooling, and minimal torque reversal. A tank engine, on the other hand, lives a brutal life. Constant stops and starts, rapid throttle changes, high torque loads, and little airflow for cooling. The conversion from aircraft to tank use was impressive on paper, but imperfect in practice. Oil seals designed for the high-altitude pressure conditions of aircraft leaked constantly under the stresses of armored vehicle operation. The cooling system, which worked beautifully in a plane flying through cold, moving air, faltered in the stifling, confined space of a tank hull. What had once been a marvel of British engineering became a constant headache for mechanics trying to keep the Cromwell running in the field. The rest of the Cromwell's drivetrain told a similar story. The Merritt-Brown gearbox was, in theory, a masterpiece, sophisticated, smooth, and capable of excellent maneuverability. But sophistication came at a price. It had too many moving parts, too many opportunities for failure, and required levels of maintenance unrealistic in battlefield conditions. The brakes were undersized for a tank capable of reaching 40 miles per hour, leading to dangerous brake fade during long descents. The clutch, meanwhile, was barely adequate to handle the Meteor engine's powerful torque, often burning out after limited use. Even the suspension, adapted from earlier cruiser tank designs, was now being pushed far beyond its limits. What worked for a lighter, slower tank became unreliable under the Cromwell's heavier frame and higher speeds. Each system, engine, transmission, brakes, and suspension, worked reasonably well on its own under laboratory conditions. But combined under the stresses of military operations, they revealed a common flaw: British tank design philosophy. Britain's engineers had long prioritized speed and firepower, assuming that reliability issues could be offset through rigorous maintenance and crew skill. This approach worked in peacetime, when tanks could be serviced at well-equipped bases and operated under controlled conditions. But it failed utterly in wartime, when tanks had to drive hundreds of miles, fight daily, and be maintained in muddy fields or roadside workshops with limited tools and exhausted crews. The Americans, by contrast, took the opposite approach. Their design philosophy placed reliability at the top of the list. Performance could be modest, as long as the vehicle worked every day, under all conditions. That single principle shaped every decision in their tank production, and the results spoke for themselves. In actual operations, a reliable tank that could always reach the battlefield was far more valuable than a theoretically superior machine that broke down en route. The embarrassment of Exercise Dracula forced British engineers into a period of painful but necessary self-examination. The Cromwell underwent a full redesign effort, directly informed by the test results. The oil seal problem was fixed with components specifically engineered for tank pressures. The brake system was overhauled and expanded. The clutch was strengthened to cope with the Meteor's torque. The suspension was reinforced to reduce the chronic failures that plagued early production. These improvements required time, months of re-engineering, testing, and coordination between factories already stretched to the limit by wartime demand. The final specification, called the Battle Cromwell, was not completed until February 1944. By late 1943, a second round of tests showed the improvements were working. The updated Cromwell was far more reliable, though it still fell short of American benchmarks. The Centaur, its underpowered sibling, fared far worse. Burdened by the outdated Liberty engine, it was essentially obsolete before it ever reached the battlefield. Most Centaurs were converted for non-combat roles: recovery vehicles, artillery observation posts, or bulldozer tanks used by engineering units. When the Cromwell finally reached the front lines in June 1944, it joined the British and Polish armored divisions landing in Normandy. In combat, it showed flashes of brilliance, fast, agile, and with a low silhouette that made it harder for German gunners to hit. Crews appreciated its speed and maneuverability, which allowed them to exploit gaps in enemy lines and perform reconnaissance duties effectively. Yet, even in victory, the old reliability concerns lingered. The Cromwell needed more maintenance hours per day than the American Sherman, and carried extra spare parts to keep pace in prolonged operations. Its 75mm gun, identical to the Sherman's, was adequate against most German tanks, but struggled badly against Panthers and Tigers. Speed and stealth became the Cromwell's best weapons: hit fast, disappear faster. But the deeper lesson of Exercise Dracula went beyond any single tank model. It was a turning point in military thinking. Reliability was not a luxury, but a combat multiplier. A tank that fails to start when needed is as useless as one destroyed in battle. A good enough tank that always works will, over time, outperform a brilliant design that constantly breaks down. This truth, which the Americans had embraced from the start, had to be learned the hard way by the British. The Sherman tank, which had so outperformed the Cromwell in testing, was itself far from perfect. Its armor was thin compared to German tanks, and its gun lacked the penetration power to defeat Panthers and Tigers frontally. Crews grimly nicknamed it the Ronson, after the lighter brand lights up the first time, every time, referring to its tendency to catch fire when hit. Polish soldiers serving under British command called it the burning grave. And yet, despite these deadly flaws, the Sherman remained the backbone of Allied armored forces until the end of the war, not because it was invincible, but because it worked. Between 1942 and 1946, American factories built an astonishing 49,324 Shermans. That production scale was unmatched by any other Western power. The Sherman could be built quickly, shipped easily, and maintained efficiently. When one was destroyed, another rolled off the assembly line almost immediately. This industrial rhythm gave the Allies a relentless momentum the Axis powers could not match. Damaged Shermans were often repaired and returned to combat within days, sometimes within 24 hours. It wasn't just a tank, it was a logistical masterpiece. Germany, meanwhile, produced about 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. Tanks that were mechanical marvels, but logistical nightmares. Their superior armor and firepower came at a heavy cost. They were slow to produce, difficult to repair, and fragile under sustained use. A German panzer division attempting a long campaign, such as the Allies' 400-mile drive across France in 1944, would have left a trail of broken tanks behind long before reaching its destination. Post-war experiments by the French army confirmed this. Captured Panthers proved hopelessly unreliable, while surplus Shermans kept running into the 1950s. Even the Soviet Union came to appreciate the Sherman's virtues. Through the Lend-Lease program, they received over 4,000 Shermans and, despite initial skepticism, grew to respect them deeply. Soviet crews, used to the rugged but crude T-34, found the American tank surprisingly comfortable and quiet. Its rubber tracks lasted twice as long, its interior was spacious, and even its padded seats felt like luxury. More importantly, it started every morning without drama, a small miracle for any Soviet tanker. Damaged Shermans were so valuable that unguarded ones would be stripped for spare parts within minutes by neighboring Soviet units. Reliability translated directly into battlefield success. Sherman-equipped divisions could advance 40 miles a day for weeks without suffering catastrophic mechanical losses. German divisions, weighed down by constant breakdowns, could not maintain that operational tempo. The result was clear. The side that kept its tanks running longer won more battles. As historian David Fletcher of the Tank Museum later summarized, the Sherman would always start in the morning. It would go all day without drama. It was not glamorous, it was not revolutionary, but it was dependable. That dependability, more than speed, armor, or firepower, made it the most effective tank of the war. The Cromwell story ultimately became one of redemption and humility. It never replaced the Sherman as Britain's primary tank, but it did restore some measure of engineering pride. The hard lessons learned from its failures shaped all future British designs. Exercise Dracula had revealed the truth of modern warfare, that the strongest weapon in any army's arsenal is not just power or innovation, but reliability. By the end of World War II, Britain had produced a total of just over 4,000 tanks in the A-27 series, Cromwells, Centaurs, and their derivatives. In comparison, the United States had rolled more than 49,000 Shermans off its production lines. The contrast was staggering, a reflection not merely of numbers, but of industrial philosophy itself. While British factories were simultaneously producing warships for the Royal Navy, aircraft for the Royal Air Force, and thousands of other weapons for global combat, American industry was relentlessly focused on efficiency, scale, and reliability. The difference showed in every mile the tanks rolled. The Cromwell, though fast and agile, remained a minority presence, serving mostly in specialized armored reconnaissance regiments where speed mattered more than brute force. Units like the famed 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, employed Cromwells for scouting missions, darting ahead of the main force. The 11th Armored Division and the Guards Armored Division also relied on Cromwell-equipped battalions for their reconnaissance roles, where mobility often meant survival. Polish armored divisions fighting under British command received Cromwells as well. They used them with remarkable skill throughout Northwest Europe, making full use of their low profile and extraordinary speed to outmaneuver German units. In this niche, the Cromwell found its true purpose, not as a line-breaking brawler, but as a nimble scout and flanking vehicle that could exploit weaknesses before heavier tanks moved in. Cromwell crews developed a unique style of combat that reflected both their courage and the tank's limitations. They never stayed still long enough for enemy guns to find them. Instead, they struck quickly, using the tank's powerful Rolls Royce Meteor engine to dart in and out of danger. The Cromwell's low silhouette helped them remain unseen until the first shot, and its speed often saved them when German armor turned its guns their way. They learned to flank the slower Panthers and Tigers, hitting their vulnerable rear armor where the Cromwell's 75mm gun could still do damage. What the Cromwell lacked in armor thickness, it compensated with movement and surprise. It was a hunter in the shadows, not a brawler in the open. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the Cromwell's story didn't end there. The tank remained in British service well into the 1950s, a testament to the improvements that had been made after the disastrous Exercise Dracula. The flaws exposed in that brutal 2,000-mile reliability test had been painstakingly corrected. In Korea, the Cromwell returned to combat once again, this time alongside the newer and heavier Centurion tanks. Beyond British service, the Cromwell found new homes around the world. Allied nations rebuilding their forces, including Australia, Austria, Finland, Israel, and Jordan, all received Cromwells through post-war military aid programs. Some were later upgraded into the Charioteer tank destroyer, fitted with a 20-pounder gun, a stopgap measure until the Centurion took over as Britain's main battle tank. That post-war career told its own story. A machine once ridiculed for breakdowns, now serving effectively across continents. The Cromwell, once a symbol of failure, had become proof that lessons learned under fire could create lasting success. But while the Cromwell found redemption, the Sherman achieved immortality. It had fought on every major front, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Europe, from the Pacific Islands to the mountains of Korea. After the war, it became the backbone of dozens of armies. It fought in the Arab-Israeli wars, in India and Pakistan, in Latin America and the Middle East. The Sherman's longevity was astonishing. Chile didn't retire its last operational units until 2003, 61 years after the first rolled off the assembly line. That kind of service life was almost unheard of. It proved that reliability wasn't just a wartime advantage, it was the foundation of legacy. Exercise Dracula, the test that had pitted Cromwell against Sherman, ultimately became one of the most important and least understood military experiments of the Second World War. Its lessons extended far beyond tanks or tactics. It reshaped how armies thought about technology itself. The test had shown, with brutal clarity, that performance on paper meant nothing without reliability in the field. A tank that could theoretically outrun or outgun the enemy was useless if it broke down halfway there. Complexity, pursued merely to achieve slightly better speed or firepower, was revealed as a trap, an expensive illusion of superiority. Mass production, ease of maintenance, and mechanical dependability mattered far more. The Americans had understood this instinctively. Their industrial system, refined through automotive production lines, ensured that every Sherman rolling out of Detroit or Chicago was nearly identical, built for consistency, not luxury. British factories, bound by traditional craftsmanship and smaller-scale methods, could never match that level of uniformity or speed. The consequences were visible everywhere. For every Cromwell that reached the battlefield, a dozen Shermans were already in combat. The Americans had built not just tanks, but a system, an industrial machine that turned reliability into victory. Yet the human element of Exercise Dracula may have been its most powerful revelation. Tank crews didn't care about theoretical top speeds or design philosophy. They cared about whether their tank would start in the morning, keep running all day, and get them home at night. A reliable tank gave its crew confidence. The kind of confidence that made men fight harder, move faster, and take calculated risks. An unreliable tank created hesitation, fear, and frustration. Crews who constantly worried about breakdowns could never fight at full strength. The test made that brutally clear. The Sherman didn't just win mechanically, it won psychologically. The final report from Exercise Dracula, stamped most secret, circulated among Britain's highest command, including Winston Churchill himself. It forced a painful reckoning. The data left no room for excuses. The Sherman required an average of just 0.03 hours of maintenance per mile driven. The Cromwell needed more than twice that, and the Centaur nearly 3 times as much. These weren't just statistics. They represented lives, missions, and victories. They meant that Sherman-equipped units could cover more ground, fight longer, and reach objectives that Cromwell units could not. In total war, that difference was decisive. From these findings came a shift in strategy. Britain would continue to rely on American tanks for the remainder of the war, while its engineers focused on developing the next generation, the Comet, and eventually the Centurion, tanks that would finally combine performance with reliability. Exercise Dracula didn't just expose mechanical flaws. It revealed a philosophical divide between two great industrial nations. American manufacturing emphasized mass production, standardization, and practical engineering. British industry prized craftsmanship, innovation, and performance, even at the cost of simplicity. Each approach had its virtues, but only one could sustain a global war of attrition. The Sherman succeeded not because it was the best on paper, but because it was good enough everywhere, all the time. It was easy to repair, easy to drive, and dependable under the worst conditions. The Cromwell, elegant and fast though it was, arrived too late and demanded too much care. Exercise Dracula became a case study that outlived the war itself. Decades later, military engineers and procurement officers still quoted its lessons. The seductive chase for cutting-edge performance had to be balanced against the boring but vital pursuit of reliability. In the mud, under fire, or halfway through a 2,000-mile test route, boring was what saved lives. For the soldiers who took part in the exercise, the lesson was unforgettable. Sherman crews walked away vindicated. Cromwell crews demanded better engineering, and eventually got it. Centaur crews were quietly relieved when told their tanks wouldn't face combat at all. Every man understood that they had witnessed something more important than a technical trial. They had seen, with their own eyes, that reliability was not a luxury. It was survival. Major General Richardson's closing words in the final report captured the truth perfectly. He wrote, "The commander of a unit equipped with Shermans can be genuinely confident of taking 99% of his vehicles into battle. If equipped with Cromwells or Centaurs, he will remain in a continuous state of anxiety." That single paragraph explained why British armored divisions continued to depend heavily on American tanks, even after domestic designs improved. The test had proven, beyond argument, that in warfare, simplicity beats sophistication, and reliability beats brilliance. In the end, Exercise Dracula wasn't just about tanks. It was about philosophies, of engineering, of leadership, and of survival. It showed that the real measure of a machine isn't how impressive it looks on paper, but whether it works when lives depend on it. The Sherman tank, reliable to the core, kept moving forward, and so did the men who trusted it. The Cromwell, elegant but fragile, became a symbol of lessons learned the hard way. And as history rolled on, the verdict of Exercise Dracula remained unchanged. In war, as in life, getting there reliably matters more than getting there fast.